Jeff, I want to talk with you a little bit about the historical Jesus. There's a great deal of interest in that topic, and primarily these days because there's two new books that are out, well, relatively recently, that are worth talking about. One called A Marginal Jew, Rethinking the Historical Jesus by John P. Meyer, that came out with Doubleday in 1991. And another one, The Historical Jesus, The Life of a Mediterranean Jewish Peasant, by John Dominic Crossan, which also came out in 1991, Harper book. And it has focused attention within the theological world on an ongoing question that has engaged us for centuries, that is the historical Jesus. So I want to begin to explore that topic a bit, and give some sort of overall observations you'd like to make as we begin that exploration.
Well, just that these are two very exciting books. When I saw a review of them, I had to get a hold of them as quickly as possible. Several years ago, there was a book by E.P. Sanders, Jesus and Judaism, that I started into, and there's something about getting at the Jesus of history that's very exciting for me, and I think for a lot of people. Friends have borrowed the books from me because they want to know too.
And also, weren't you using a material in a class you were teaching, or preparing one?
Well, I do a course on the history of Christianity, and it's interesting to me that the textbook that we use in the first segment of that, from the origins of the Christian movement up until the Reformation or the Renaissance, there's no chapter on Jesus. And I've never decided it's maybe because the author's chicken, doesn't want to wrestle with it, but it's a very difficult question, and it's always helpful for me at the beginning of that course to say, what do we know about Jesus historically? And it sort of sets the tone for the course to point out, here are things we believe about Jesus, but can we pin them down historically? Can we control time and place here? And that's what history is about. What can we verify with some data about time and place and what actually happened? I sound like von Ranke in the 19th century, but that's the sort of approach to get at that. And students have to slip into that historical mindset, and it moves us away in some sense, as Meyer in the beginning of his book says. He's going to do history. He's not talking about faith, per se. He's not talking about what we believe about Jesus, what Jesus means, if you will, but what actually happened there as best we can recover that.
I think doesn't have an interesting thing. He imagines a Catholic, a Protestant, a Jew, and an agnostic locked in the Harvard Divinity School library, he says, until they come up with a consensus document on who Jesus of Nazareth was and what he intended in his own time and place. That's his sense of what he's about. Let's get people, even agnostics or atheists, if looking at the sources, what can you really end up saying about Jesus of Nazareth?
And there's a very scientific sense about his book. It's very cool. It's very rational. Here are all the arguments for and against, and I'm going to play these off against each other, and I'm going to make a judgment. And in doing that, he's very clear that this is our best, or his best guess about the historical Jesus. He makes a distinction between the Jesus who lived and died and we believe rose from the dead, and what we're able to recover historically. Those are really two different things. Just as last year I did a lot of work on my family tree, I really don't have access to my great-grandmother, but using records, the city directories and things, I found out a lot of things about her. I really don't know much about her personality, but I can demonstrate some things about her, an Irish immigrant in the 1880s, moving from residence to residence in very close periods of time. It said to me she had a real hard life with her daughter, finding somewhere to live.
Excellent example, yes. Well, let's just set the framework a little bit for this whole search. There's an obvious answer to this. Well, yeah, we know a lot about Jesus. It's in the Gospels, and just go read the Gospels, and then you'll know about the historical Jesus. And as we know, in the last couple of centuries, we have had an ongoing debate among Scripture scholars and theologians about the relationship between the Jesus of history and the Christ of faith. And the point of that is that in the Gospels, which we assume are written somewhere around the year 70, the first one Mark, and Matthew and Luke in the middle 80s, and John in the middle 90s. Those are rough consensus estimates about the dating of the Gospels, although we must say there's minority voices who disagree with that. But that picture of Jesus that we get in the Gospels is obviously influenced by the faith, by reflection on Jesus over many decades. These Gospels do not purport to be objective accounts, kind of academic biographies that we would assume would be in place today. They are faith documents written by believers in order to help others to believe, to spread the faith. So they have a bias built into them, and they give us a picture of Jesus. The question becomes, is that Christ of faith that people believed in 70, 80, and 90, and are reflected in the Gospels, what's the connection between that Christ and the historical Jesus who walked the earth and did certain things? That's been the debate of the 19th and 20th century or before, and we must say that at some points there's been a very agnostic position on that. Some people have said, well, you really can't say much about that at all. I remember one scholar saying about the most you can say is that there was an itinerant rabbi by the name of Jesus who once said Abba. That was an extreme agnostic position on this whole question.
And I think as a result of that, someone like the great biblical scholar Rudolf Bultmann, would say the historical Jesus isn't very important. What is important is that witness of faith that comes out of that we have in the Gospels, in the New Testament, the kerygma, what the preached belief about Jesus, and that's what we really rest our faith on. And so the historical Jesus, since the historical Jesus isn't accessible, that's not important. What's important is that faith. I think what we're seeing now with Meyer's book and Crossan's book is a swing back to saying, what can we demonstrate, our best guess, what's there in the Gospels. And it means using the Gospels in a critical way, to not simply accept everything that's there as history or biography. And frankly, if you read them carefully, Mark's Gospel is the obvious example. This is not a critical biography. Jesus he moves from one place to the other. He's doing things very quickly. And then he said this, and then he said that. And I want to know when he takes a nap, what do they do in the evenings? There's none of that sort of detail. It's not biographical stuff.
Right. And in one sense disappointing to people, and it raises questions, but on the other hand it has a certain other engaging quality about it. And Jesus presented as the hidden Messiah in Mark, who is the bringer of the kingdom, and who suffers death, and in a sense is an embarrassment to some people at least. Well, let's, with that sort of background, I want to use John Meyer's categories, Jeff, as a way of getting at this. The title of his book is revealing. It's called A Marginal Jew. And what Meyer says is that Jesus is marginal in a lot of different ways, set on the margins. I don't know if that word is real good for people, but it means that he's not in the mainstream, that he was different in some ways, that he didn't fit into many categories or the styles of the time and so on. So that notion that Jesus is a marginal Jew might be worth exploring. And I just want to take up here one way that Meyer says he's marginal. And that is in terms of the way he lived economically. The presumption would be that Jesus grew up with a trade that he learned from Joseph, his father, that he was a carpenter. But at some point in his life he abandons this and goes off and becomes an itinerant preacher, which is an odd thing to do and caused all kind of problems for him. And it put him on the margins economically. It made him dependent. It made people wonder what's wrong with this guy. He's out wandering around doing his preaching instead of staying with his job like he should be doing and so on. So I wonder if we might look at Jesus in that way, with that kind of marginal character.
I find that interesting. And I find, too, what goes with it, the social situation, too, that he leaves his family in a world where family is exceptionally important, and that's where you find your identity, and that's how you're connected to the planet. In leaving his job and moving out as an itinerant preacher, he leaves his family as well, and takes on these disciples. Really, they become Jesus' family in some wise.
So let's set the stage for this now. Our sense is that Jesus is rooted in Nazareth, that this is his hometown. In fact, it brings up a difficult problem. I almost hate to bring it up right away in historical Jesus, but that is where Jesus was born. And I think that some people might find what the scholarly world says about that rather shocking, and maybe it deserves a real long explanation, but in brief, there are many scholars who think that Jesus was born in Nazareth, that was his hometown, and that the story of his birth in Bethlehem is a theological explanation given to us by Matthew and Luke, which suggests that he is the son of David, since Bethlehem is David's city. And I don't know where that leaves people exactly, but do you want to comment on it or have your way of explaining that?
Well, more than one student, dealing with this in a course, I've ruined more than one person's Christmas, at least by their estimation, and that's not the point at all, to take a shot at that. And what happens is, when we look at the Gospels, we don't have anything from Mark or John about where Jesus was born, and when we look at Luke and Matthew, they disagree with one another about Jesus' birth and how that happens, and how they happen to be in Bethlehem. I mean, he's known as Jesus of Nazareth. That's Jesus' hometown. Matthew leads us to believe that they had a home there and they're living there. It's Luke's gospel that gives us the information that seems that they're in this cave where the animals are when Jesus is born. As you said, very likely these are both what some scholars call theologumena. It's an attempt to make a theological point about Jesus and Jesus' origins. And I have to say, even though historically the best scholars seem to say Jesus is born and raised in Nazareth, on Christmas I drag my kids up to the crib and we look at all the stuff and we tell the story precisely because of the information that's there about who Jesus is and what Jesus means. It's still terribly powerful and terribly important. And that's why I think Meyer rightly makes a distinction between the Jesus of history and what we believe about Jesus. Those stories, those Christmas stories, tell us about a God who's for the poor.
And that's really well said. I like the part about your family and your children and so on, and the way you would tell the story, and the story of Jesus' birth, and the stable, and no room in the inn, and all of the Bethlehem connections and so on do teach very powerful lessons about who Jesus is, especially as we see in Matthew that he's clearly the son of David, comes from David's city, and he will be the great king, as David was a great king. He would be the messianic king. So the stories are wonderful and beautiful, but when we look at this other historical thing, the thing that we're very sure of and know is that Jesus' hometown was Nazareth. And Nazareth puts us now in Lower Galilee, north of Judea, where Jerusalem is. And we're now into the hinterlands, in a sense. And we're into a whole different setting when we say that Jesus grew up in Nazareth. There's an interesting thing that in talking about Nazareth that helps to locate all of this. In Crossan's book, he makes a big thing out of the fact that Jesus is a peasant. And by peasant, he has a very distinctive meaning of that. He says that to be a peasant meant that you were sort of rooted in the earth somehow, in the agricultural environment and economy, but that the peasants also had some relationship to cities, to nearby cities that were more popular and powerful and so on. And that he sees Jesus in that way. He doesn't see Jesus as like a country bumpkin. He sees him as a peasant, someone rooted in the earth who tells stories about agriculture easily, but also who knew things about the larger world through the connection with the bigger cities around. Nazareth's a very tiny place, of course.
There's almost a social hierarchy, I think, the way he expresses it. There's some large city upon which some smaller towns will be dependent, and then upon those would be dependent little villages. And Jesus comes, again, this is Meyer's term, not Crossan's, but this marginality. He's sort of at the farthest edge of that social structure. He's sort of spun out there on the farthest side. And so that the things that happen in the city would eventually have an effect on Jesus and his situation, but it's to use a term from the recent election, it's a trickle-down sort of thing. It's something that would make its way out to him. And so he's not unaware of what goes on in the cities, and he's not unaware of what's going on in the larger world around him. But on the other hand, he's on the margins. He's not in the center of the project. He's not at Rome, for example. Right.
Nor is he in Jerusalem.
Exactly.
The center of Jewish life. Nor is he even in the center of Galilean life. He's on the margins of that as well. So again, trying to locate Jesus with this idea of a marginal Jew. Do you think we need to say more about Jew here? Because his mother Mary is clearly a Jew. His supposed father Joseph is a Jew. He lives in a Jewish environment. All of that we need to say as well. So we got two words here: a marginal Jew. But we got to remember the Jewishness as well.
I think that's crucial. A student in a class that I'm teaching right now, an African-American woman said at her house she's having an argument with her husband. Should they have a picture of Jesus where he looks like he's African? Or should they have one that looks like the regular picture? And I said, well, tell me, what does the regular picture look like? She said, well, it's this blonde, blue-eyed. I said, this sounds like a Northern European to me. It seems like we've already transformed this Jesus. I said, it seems appropriate to me to have an African-American Jesus in your home. She said, I want to say something to my kids about who Jesus is. I said, that's exactly the point. But what happens, and it's a good process to do that because we make the identification. The problem is we lose touch with who Jesus is and Jesus' origins, and Jesus is a Jew. John's Gospel perhaps is what leads us astray often because it's John's Gospel where Jesus seems to be opposed to the Jews. It's a little bit like saying, Bill Clinton or George Bush against the Americans, as if they are not one of the Americans. And Jesus is very much a Jew, and to understand Jesus at all, you have to have a sense of his utter Jewishness.
So he would have grown up in a Jewish family. He would have learned about the Jewish scriptures as a youngster. Some people feel he would have gone to some sort of school, religious education program that they had in Nazareth, at a synagogue there, that he would have learned about his faith, that periodically his family would have taken him to Jerusalem for the big feasts, and that he would have learned that way about his faith. So, and that when he begins to preach, he goes back to those metaphors and symbols and historical figures to help identify himself and his cause to other people. So you cannot understand Jesus apart from his Jewishness. He is rooted in that culture. That's he spoke Aramaic in his dealings with ordinary people, although we think that some scholars, I think that Meyer is one of them, thinks that he might have known a little bit of Greek in his job as a woodworker, and that he would have known some Hebrew, maybe learning that in relationship to studying the scriptures. But Aramaic would have been the tongue that he would have spoken at home and the way he would have spoken to people when he preached.
What's interesting then about Jesus' teaching, and maybe this is where these two themes about being marginal and being a Jew come together, when he preaches, he operates out of that vast storehouse of what we call the Old Testament, the Jewish tradition, but he fleshes it out in earthy little agrarian stories, little stories from his village in Nazareth, things that catch the imagination of his listeners, so that it's a story of a farmer sowing seed. It's the story of someone finding a treasure in a field or finding a pearl of great price. These are little stories that from observations that he made in his little village as he grew up.
Indeed, and we have to emphasize here, I think, how ordinary Jesus would have appeared in his village for maybe something like 33 years. Common dating for the birth of Jesus is 6 B.C., which might surprise people, and the reason we date it that way is that Herod the Great, who was alive when Jesus was born, died in 4 B.C. This is all due to an error in the calendar by Dennis the Little, much later, but he intended to date Jesus as the year 1, the beginning of the new era. But we've got Jesus born somewhere between 6 B.C., and then for functioning all the way up to probably the year 28 in his hometown as a very ordinary fellow. The carpenter, the son of the woodworker, Joseph. So how some people translate that, of the woodworker, broader than maybe our word carpenter today. But a very ordinary life. One way we know that is when he came back to Nazareth to preach, it is said that he could not work miracles there. And why? Because the people wouldn't accept him. He was so ordinary. Who is this? This is Jesus the carpenter, or Jesus the son of Joseph the carpenter.
Chapter 6 of Mark's Gospel, right. They have no faith. They did not believe in him. And this is something that certainly we don't hear from the pulpit very much, this conflict that we see is, again, in Mark's Gospel, the Gospel we think that is the earliest of the Gospels, and that there might be some history there, that his mother and his brothers and sisters, and if you thought the stuff about the crib and being born in Bethlehem was trouble, Meyer brings up the question about Jesus' brothers and sisters. These people seem to reject him. They seem, he's crazy. They've come to get him because there's something wrong with our boy, and we want to bring him home.
That should be emphasized in terms of this marginality. It occurred even with his own family. The implication is that his own mother did not understand him in Mark's Gospel as well. Mm-hmm. His mother and his brothers and sisters. We should note here that Joseph is not mentioned in that, and what Meyer accepts the traditional idea that Joseph was dead by the year 28 when Jesus went out and began to do his public preaching. so that Joseph is not mentioned, but we do hear about his mother Mary and his brothers and sisters. 4 brothers that are mentioned, and 2 and unnamed sisters, presumably 2 of them.
At least 2.
At least 2,
plural.
Yeah. At least 2. So, but the point that you're making, which really needs, he was on the margin, even in relationship to his family. They thought he was crazy, mad, is what the way we translate it, I think, today, that he was mad out there doing this preaching. He had quit his job. He doesn't have any income now. He doesn't have any support. He's saying things that we really don't understand and seem strange to us. And they think we better go get him and bring him back home, back into the hearth, the home, the family setting, where maybe he can get his head together again and can get straightened out. It's a very intriguing notion there in Mark's Gospel.
You get a sense, a few years ago you and I had the opportunity to talk about Martin Scorsese's movie of Nico Kazantzakis' book, The Last Temptation of Christ, and an attempt to portray Jesus as he grows and tries to figure out what he's going to do. And it's precisely out of this sort of sense in Mark, where Jesus grows and finds a mission and begins to test that. As all of us grow and begin to test who we are and what we're going to do with our lives, we often come into conflict with our families. This is what I want to be. This is what I want to do. And Mark's Gospel is very clear that this was not a smooth and easy road for Jesus.
We get a remembrance of that, don't we, that just comes to my mind now about the trip to Jerusalem when for one of the feasts, when Jesus is left behind and he's engaged in dialogue with the teachers there, and his parents leave and have lost him, and then they must go back and find him, and they are all upset. And here already we get at an early age a remembrance of deviant behavior, I mean, this man has not functioned properly. He's a child that is a little different here in some ways. I don't know what to make of that in terms of the overall perception of Jesus as being on the margins, but the story does come back to me, and I don't remember how Meyer treats that exactly.
Oh, I think there are questions about the historicity of the story, but like the infancy narratives, it makes the theological point that there's some connection between Jesus and the temple, and that he's asking, and what I like about that particular story is, if you look at the text closely, he's asking questions of these people. It's not that he has answers and they're impressed that he knows everything, but rather he's got his finger on the right questions, and they're very taken with this little kid who already has a sense of what's really important.
When we think, Jeff, about Jesus then out in he leaves his home at probably, maybe 33 or 34 years of age after living this very ordinary life, and then he goes about preaching and this idea that the kingdom is coming and you must reform your life and turn things around and so on. Even in the midst of that public ministry, then he is on the margins. For one thing, he can't support himself. He has no place. We get a remembrance of that in the Gospel. He has no place to lay his head. He doesn't have a home, and he keeps moving about. I think generally these scholars accept the idea that Jesus did often go down to Jerusalem. That's Meyer's point, and Crossan accepts that as well. That's the way John portrays it. The Synoptics have a picture of Jesus staying up in Galilee throughout the whole of his public life, and then going down for that final feast of Passover into the capital city, Jerusalem, when he's apprehended and killed. But these scholars seem to attempt to accept John's portrayal of it, the other gospel. We call Matthew, Mark, and Luke the Synoptics because they're very similar. John is different. John has him going down there periodically for feasts over a couple-year period, and in doing that, and Jesus again would be moving about. He would be this itinerant preacher moving about in Galilee, but then also going down to Jerusalem, coming back up, and so on. No place to lay his head.
Luke, I think especially talks about the people who support Jesus, and there are a group of women who provide for Jesus out of their purses.
Evidently fairly well-to-do, or enough at least to help out.
And some scholars have pointed out that these women may have left more behind than Peter and James and John, in that these women, it would be supposed, they're moving about with these men to whom they're not married, that there's something very shady going on here, and they would be greatly disrespected. And in a culture where, and both of these authors make this point, you gain your honor or your shame from what people around you think. They gave up in some ways much more than simply their money, or simply the families that Peter and James and John gave up. Rather, they gave up their sense of self-respect or the respect
their
of the people around them.
reputation,
Their reputation, yeah.
You made a very important point there that would have to be played out in greater detail, and that is that this culture of Jesus was an honor-shame culture, that where the esteem of others was absolutely crucial to living an effective life. And that's what highlights the strangeness of Jesus adopting this posture of going out and with no job and giving up his career and his settled life and not having a place to stay, being dependent upon these women who followed him. Very odd behavior, which puts him on very much on the margin in that society, which is, as you said, shame, honor-oriented.
Mm-hmm. And in a sense, we're back to the infancy narratives in the sense that the people to whom the gospel is announced there are the shepherds in the field who can't fulfill the law, who can't do all the stuff and stand at the heart of the culture. These are the people that Jesus speaks to most effectively, because he's saying God cares deeply for you. Even though it doesn't look like you're in the honor side of the balance sheet, you have a value that's immense.
That's a wonderful play off in this. Well, Jeff, we've been looking at just one aspect of the historical Jesus. Crucial figures. You said it's exciting, it's enthralling to look at this figure, this person who's been the most influential in history and made such a difference, and to go back and see what was he really like. And our point here is, following John Meyer, is that he was a marginal Jew. And he lived on the margin economically because he left his job and went about and preached the good news to people, cared for them, showed compassion for them, and did it in ways that were very unconventional in those days.